Hello, scholars. This is Mrs. Mullis from Jenkins High. Today we have a U.S. history lesson on the early Cold War. Let's get started. Our learning goal today is to explain and analyze the reasons for the Cold War changes in American foreign policy during this early Cold War period. Now, you'll be hearing about the Cold War for lots of the next lessons. Right? You've talked about World War I, you've talked about World War II, but the Cold War is going to last for the next 40 years, almost to the end of the U.S. history course. So you'll be hearing about this, so let's get in and dissect what that Cold War period was about. This is U.S. History Standard 20A. Here's our I can statements. Okay, at the end of this lesson, I want you to be able to say, I can define what the Cold War is, and I know why it was a change in American foreign policy. I know what the reasons for the Cold War policy changes were, and I know what those policies are. They're containment, the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, the creation of NATO. Those are the ways we changed our U.S. foreign policy during this early Cold War period. And finally, I want you to be able to understand and to say, I can explain what that Domino Theory is in American foreign policy. It's a weird term, but I know what it is, and I know why the U.S. went ahead to fight in the Korean War, and I know why we fought in lots of proxy wars around the globe for the next 40 years during the Cold War period. All right, so let's begin. Today, I want you to have a piece of paper handy so you can take some notes, and as we go through, we will periodically stop and ask some questions and see if you can answer them. When we get to the very end, I've created a Kahoot for you to go and look up and see if you can play that and get all the answers correct. So, our very first topic, what was the Cold War and how did it change American foreign policy? So, first of all, let's get in and dissect the Cold War and what people say. They say this term a lot. What do they mean? So the Cold War was never actually a war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Eventually, as you learn more about the Cold War, you'll realize there were lots of actual wars involved during this period. But when people say Cold War, they actually mean a period of time. And in this period, there's a very high level of tension and rivalry between the United States and Western democratic nations, places like Great Britain and France and West Germany, and the Soviet Union and its communist allies in Eastern Europe and later on in Asia. So that's what they mean, this period of tension, geopolitical tension between the United States and the Western allies and the Soviet Union and its allies, an East versus West rivalry. Period lasts from 1945 at the very end of World War II all the way to 1991 when the Soviet Union is dissolved and breaks apart into about 15 different nations. It's going to be a drastic change in American foreign policy and our domestic policy. That'll be your next lesson about the changes in American domestic policy because of the Cold War. Today we're going to focus on foreign policy. It leads us into a very, very dangerous nuclear arms race. We're still dealing with the repercussions of that today, nuclear weapons and the threat of nuclear war. Very long-lasting military alliances for the first time in United States history, ones that we're still involved in today, and a lot of proxy wars, and we'll talk about exactly what that term means in a minute, in places like Korea and Vietnam, and eventually all around the world. All right, so that's the Cold War. How does it go about changing our foreign policy, all right, particularly after the U.S. involvement in World War II? So foreign policy is how the U.S. interacts with other countries around the world, politically, militarily. That's our foreign policy. Domestic policy, how the U.S. engages in actions inside the United States and for its citizens. But here we're talking about foreign policy. Up until World War I, and then after World War I, up until World War II, the United States had always followed a policy of isolationism, or at least partial isolationism with respect to, in particular, conflicts in Europe. Right? Our very first president, George Washington, had said, avoid entangling alliances with Europe. Right? Just follow our own self-interest in our foreign policy And up until World War I, the United States had pretty much done that. There was a change during World War I. We got in on the very end of that war. And after the war, a lot of people regretted it. You've already had this lesson. We go back to a period of partial isolationism, and we don't really get involved in world affairs at that level until we're sort of forced into it by World War II. Right? So, no foreign entanglements. After World War II, everything changes. All right? So, we become a world leader. We accept our role as a world superpower, and we engage in a foreign policy called internationalism. It's going to lead us to do things like help create and be a founding member of the United Nations, which is a body for world cooperation and to try and resolve conflicts on a worldwide level. It's going to involve us all around the world. And so after World War II, we realize we must engage internationally with the rest of the world. And so that period of isolationism is over, and it has been over since 1945. So how does this Cold War actually begin? How does it get started? So first you have to understand what Europe looks like at the end of World War II, and not just Europe, places all around the world. It is in ruins. Factories are destroyed, roads, bridges, trains, right? Homes, millions and millions of homes are destroyed. People are homeless. People are going hungry. Famine is a real concern all across places that are normally very prosperous like Western Europe. The only two remaining countries with significant levels of power are the United States and the USSR, or the Soviet Union, what we call Russia today. Western Europe really doesn't have the power to engage on an international basis like it did before the war. So the Allies, and remember the Allies, you've just talked about World War II, the Allies include the United States, Great Britain, France, many other countries, but also the Soviet Union. We are all fighting in World War II against Hitler, against Japan. Right? At the end of the war, the Allies are disagreeing about what's going to happen to Eastern Europe. And this territory between the Soviet Union and that big red block right there, and that lighter color pink territory, which is the sort of Eastern Europe, and the rest of Western Europe. What's going to happen to it? How is it going to be handled? It had been liberated by the Russians, but what's going to happen to it after the war? So that's the dispute, right, that we have with the Soviets. Right, so they had already made plans, and this is our big three world leaders at Yalta. Right, on the left-hand side, you see the British Prime Minister and Great War Leader Winston Churchill. In between there in the middle is our President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And on the right side there is Joseph Stalin. And Joseph Stalin is the General Secretary of Soviet Russia and has been their ruler since 1924. Right? These gentlemen had worked together throughout most of the war. They were comfortable with one another, and they got together in February of 1945 and made some decisions about what was going to happen with Germany and Poland and other places in Eastern Europe. We called them the Big Three, all right? And so they made some decisions, all right? It wasn't perfect, but you can see here one of the things they decided was how we're going to divide up Germany, right? Hitler's Germany. We're going to divide it into 4 parts. Right? On the eastern side, Russia's going to have a zone of occupation, and on the west and in the middle, you will have the British, the French, and the Americans, each with their own occupation zone. We're going to do the same thing for the capital city of Berlin, even though it's located inside the Soviet occupation zone. Those are all agreed. They also said that big area that I showed you just a moment ago between Russia and the rest of Western Europe, we're going to have free elections, because that area had been overrun by Nazi Germany. So we're going to allow those people to engage in self-determination and decide for themselves what kind of government that they want. That was the plan. Here's what actually happened, right? So things began to fall apart. First of all, there's a couple of things going on to give you some background here. And the first is that you all know that the United States had been developing an atomic weapon. And by July of 1945, they are considering dropping those weapons on Japan. And at the same time, they are having another meeting, another conference with the big three allies to resolve what's going to go on in Eastern Europe. So they meet in Potsdam, Germany in 1945 in July. All right, they've got the threat of the nuclear weapons being dropped for the first time on Japan going on, something that the Soviet president learns about for the first time at Potsdam. And you've got the fact that they're concerned that the Soviets aren't following through on their promises of withdrawing their troops from that area of Eastern Europe, and they're not going to allow them to have free elections. Now, at Potsdam, we have a different set of big three. These are not people who have worked together throughout the war. We still have Joseph Stalin representing Russia, but the United States president now is Harry Truman. President Roosevelt had died in April of '45. President Truman is new to the job, right? This is his first major foreign policy event here with Stalin. And for the British, they have retired their very famous British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and put in a man named Clement Attlee. So both Mr. Attlee and Truman, President Truman, are new to negotiations with President Stalin, and things just don't go well. All right, so the Soviets say, we know what we said earlier, but we are going to demand that we have a sphere of influence that we can control in Eastern Europe. We're not going to withdraw these troops. We're not going to have free elections. Okay. So at this point, Western Europe says to the U.S., we're really too devastated ourselves at this point to respond to a new threat from the Soviet Union after just defeating Hitler. But that's where the situation stands, and gradually allies turn into enemies. All right? A situation that's going to affect our foreign policy for the next 4 decades. So our first Cold War president is President Truman. Every president up through President Bush, all right, the first President Bush is going to be a Cold War president. So you've got a lot of presidents to go. The very first one, Harry Truman, right, very new to the presidency, and he says, how are we going to address this communist threat? And he says, we're going to put in a policy of containment. I'm going to tell you what those are, and we'll talk about them one by one in a minute. We're going to establish a new doctrine about how to deal with Soviet aggression. We're going to help our friends in Western Europe get their economy started again. We're going to make some long-term military alliances. And if need be, we'll go to war to fight the spread of communism. From allies, containment. The second president we're going to talk about is Dwight David Eisenhower. He had been one of our great generals during World War II. Right? He's elected in 1952 and serves throughout the 50s as our president. Even though he's a military man, he's going to take a more non-military, direct military action approach. He says, we're going to end our involvement in the Korean War. We are going to take a new look policy at containment. We are going to focus on the development of our arms as a threat to Soviet aggression, and develop a policy called massive retaliation. So let's dive into President Truman's policies. All right, so in 1946, now Potsdam was in 1945. In August of 1945, the United States drops 2 bombs on Japan. Japan surrenders. The war is over, right? Shortly after that, Winston Churchill, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain, comes to the United States. He's very popular here. He's half American. And he goes to Missouri with President Truman, and he makes a speech at a college there that he wants everybody to pay attention to. And that speech is known as the Iron Curtain speech. And what Prime Minister Churchill has come to say is basically to sound the alarm bell. He's saying, America, you must come in and help us fight Soviet aggression. His exact words, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lies Central and Eastern Europe in the Soviet sphere, and all are subject to Soviet influence and to a very high and in some cases increasing measure of control from Moscow. He sounds the alarm bell, and the message he sends to the United States, and it's received, is the U.S. must help us, must assist Western Europe in stopping Soviet aggression. Now, Some other things we need to understand about why things became such an intense rivalry is the fact that the societies of the United States and the Soviet Union, the societies in the western part of Europe and the eastern part of Europe and in Asia were very different at this point in time. Right? The United States, we are a capitalist nation. We believe in free market control. We view ourselves as democratic. We are very proud of the freedoms and rights that we maintain as Americans, and we were very fearful of the spread of communism and what that meant to our economic and political well-being. The Soviet Union, on the other side, had had a very different experience. They had lived for a long time under authoritarian rule by a czar. That government had been replaced by a non-democratic communist government that became very totalitarian under Joseph Stalin. They are people who had been invaded many, many times over the last couple of hundred years, and they feared invasion, and they wanted their security and valued their security more than their freedom. So their actions were taken to protect themselves against what they perceived as a possible Western invasion. All of that leading to great suspicion and distrust between East and West during this period of time. All right, so let's stop and reflect. If you've got that piece of paper, take it out. Otherwise, just think about these answers. What was the Cold War? Let's see if we've got the major points that we'd like to get. So, what was the Cold War? How long did it last? Name a president who was involved in the Cold War. How did U.S. foreign policy change or differ after World War II? What issue did the U.S. and the Soviet Union disagree about? And finally, what was the Iron Curtain speech? So go ahead and stop the video, take a moment, see if you know the answer to these questions, turn it back on, and we'll go over the answers. All right, scholars, let's see how you did. What was the Cold War? It was a period of heightened tension between the U.S. and the USSR. If you said it was a rivalry between the U.S. and USSR, that gets it. Point is, it's a period of time, it's a level of tension, all right? It is not an actual war. How long does it last? 4 decades, or from 1945 to 1991. A president who was involved in the Cold War, you could have said President Truman or President Eisenhower. How did U.S. foreign policy differ? We became a world leader. We had an internationalist foreign policy. What issue did we disagree about? Control over Eastern Europe. And finally, what was the Iron Curtain speech? Winston Churchill's warning about Soviet aggression in Eastern Europe. All right, great. I hope you got those. Let's move on to our second topic. So, what were the U.S. policies actually during the Cold War? And we alluded to these earlier, President Truman's policy of containment and the 3 prongs of that we're going to discuss now. All right, the containment policy was this, all right? We're going to stop the spread of communist influence in Eastern Europe from expanding any further than where it is. So implicit in this definition of communism or containment of communism is we're going to put it in a box and not let it grow any bigger. We're not going to undo where communism already is. All right, and we'll see what that means, particularly in China and Korea in a moment. So later on, we'll take that policy of containment, not from just Eastern Europe, but to Asia and to around the world. Those 3 major prongs that President Truman puts into place when we talk about containment. The Truman Doctrine in 1947, we're going to send money and aid to people who are fighting communist aggression. The Marshall Plan, we're going to help shore up our Western European neighbors and their economy so communism won't spread there. And then finally, we're going to form a military alliance with our Western European neighbors to prevent the Soviets from expanding and to provide them military support. All right, so the Truman Doctrine, right, sounds off and starts off this doctrine of containment. Here's what's going on, all right? In Greece, there is a civil war between a democratically elected government and a communist insurgent group. And next to Greece, in Turkey, they also have communist insurgents and also pressure from the Soviet Union regarding some of their waterways. And it looks like those areas might fall to communism. All right, so President Truman comes in. excuse me, I'm going the wrong direction. All right, President Truman comes in and issues the Truman Doctrine, who says the United States is going to step in and provide support to free people who are resisting communism by armed minorities or by outside pressures. Here is President Truman delivering that message to Congress in 1947.
It is necessary only to glance at a map to realize that the survival and integrity of the Greek nation are of grave importance in a much wider situation. If Greece should fall under the control of an armed minority, the effect upon its neighbor Turkey would be immediate and serious. Confusion and disorder might well spread throughout the entire Middle East. Should we fail to aid Greece and Turkey in this fateful hour, the effect will be far-reaching to the west as well as to the east. We must take immediate and resolute action. I therefore ask the Congress to provide authority for assistance to Greece and Turkey in the amount of $400 million for the period ending June 30th, 1948. The seeds of totalitarian regimes are nurtured by misery and want. They spread and grow in the evil soil of poverty and strife. They reach their full growth when the hope of a people for a better life has died. We must keep that hope alive. The free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedom. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of this nation. Great responsibilities have been placed upon us by the swift movement of events. I am confident that the Congress will face these responsibilities squarely.
Okay, there you see President Truman explaining why we are initiating the Truman Doctrine, why he's asking Congress for $400 million to help Greece and Turkey around the world fight their civil war. And you can tell from the tone of his language that already by this time in 1947, a great deal of hostility and distrust has come between the Soviet Union and the United States and the Eastern powers. So once again, we're going to support free people around the world eventually who are fighting communism. Any means necessary is the term that he uses. And of course, that leads to $400 million to go into Greece and Turkey and lots of financial aid to countries around the world since that period of time. Now, the second part of Truman's plan was the Marshall Plan. And this is from one of our World War II generals, Thomas Marshall, who's now serving as a Secretary of State. He is convinced when he visits Europe that something must be done to help the economies of Western Europe, and to prevent the spread of communism in those areas. We spend $13.3 billion, that would be about $125 billion today, to send money to 22 different European nations for about a 4-year period, and it works. The money is sent to help rebuild businesses, to capitalize those businesses, right? And it also helps Americans. Those Europeans use some of that money to buy American goods after the war. We offered it to the Eastern European countries, and the Soviets refused on their behalf. But you can see, right, the Western European economies are going to grow by 25%, and by 1950 or so, they're back up to their pre-war levels of production in those countries. So a very successful policy. Here you can see on the map on the right, the different levels of money that went to different countries, right? But a lot of it, of course, going to the United Kingdom and to France and to Western Germany. The last part of this is our permanent military alliance, is NATO, which stands for North American Treaty Organization. It is a long-lasting military alliance, an alliance where it's basically an attack on one is an attack on all. So If someone attacks the United Kingdom, it's the same as if they had attacked the United States in terms of war. That alliance has been going strong since 1949, still going on today. Today we have 30 members in North America and in Europe as a part of that military alliance. In response to the NATO alliance, the Soviets will form in 1955 what is known as the Warsaw Pact, which is a similar pact between the Soviet nation and its allies in Eastern Europe and in Asia. The first test of the Cold War came in 1948 and 1949. Now, remember that we had said that Berlin was divided into occupation zones, the city, just like Germany itself was. Right, and by 1948, those have sort of coalesced into West Berlin for the Western occupied areas and East Berlin for the Russian areas, a city divided in two. Now, the Berlin Wall's not there yet, but the Soviets, and particularly Stalin, sees this as a Western gate into Eastern Europe and Eastern Germany, and so he, in 1948, decides to blockade, all roads and all trains going into Berlin. How do the Western nations respond? They respond with this heroic effort to feed and supply a city of 2.5 million people for about 11 months by airplane. About 200,000 different sorties or trips where they are dropping food and fuel and other necessities to the people of West Berlin until finally Stalin just gives up. All right, he realizes the point has passed. All right, and he withdraws the blockades, and West Berlin continues to exist. So let's stop and look at this. All right, can you tell me what the containment policy was? Right. What were the three parts of the policy? And what was the first major test? So stop the video, take a moment, see if you know those, and we'll pick back up with the answers. Okay, let's see if you got it. The containment policy. What was it? If you said something along the lines of it was designed to stop the spread of communism, you're there. To prevent Soviet military aggression, you've got the idea. The three parts of the policy: the Truman Doctrine, right, to provide military assistance to countries fighting communism, the Marshall Plan to rebuild European economies, and NATO, our military alliance. And the first test of that policy came with the Berlin airlift in 48 and 49. Awesome. All right, let's go on. Last topic, this domino theory. How did an idea or a political theory called the domino theory lead the United States into wars in Asia, such as the Korean War and later on the Vietnam War? Right, a very important theory that's really going to divide the world into two parts, East and West. And you can see here by the map, the blue areas were viewed as the West, though some of them, like Australia, are actually in the East. And the red and yellow areas are Soviet and Chinese areas of communist control. Right, so the domino theory is the idea, if you've ever played dominoes, that, right, if you stack them all up and right next to each other, and then you push one, they're all going to fall down. And the domino theory said countries in Asia, and particularly Southeast Asia, were the same as these dominoes. That if one country in China fell to communism, one country in Asia fell to communism, like China, that the rest would begin to fall, that Korea would become communist, that Vietnam would become communist, that Laos, Cambodia, and then Thailand, right? So that idea dominated our thinking from the 1940s to the 1980s, and in truth, China, Korea, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia did at one point adopt communist governments. So there was some reality in this that communism was spreading in that area. Right? It doesn't necessarily spread to those others. In particular, we're going to talk about China, Korea, and Vietnam, right? And we begin with China. So in China, in 1949, the communist and nationalist leader Mao Zedong is going to defeat the Western-supported nationalist army, the Kuomintang, and take over China, and China becomes a communist nation. Now, you'll learn about in your lesson on domestic policy just how serious a crisis this was for the Americans. It's going to lead to a Red Scare inside the United States, one we call McCarthyism. That's going to lead us into the Korean War because of the Domino Theory. So we're going to go fight a war with others in Korea, far away from the United States, because we're fearful of communism spreading to other places. Eventually, this will take us into some initial support for Vietnam in the 40s and the 60s, or not for Vietnam, for fighting a war in Vietnam against the nationalists and communists there, and into a full-scale war in the 1960s that you'll talk about in another lesson. So the Korean War is really our topic here. How did the United States come to fight a war in Korea on the other side of the world? Well, first you have to understand what happened to Korea at the end of the World War II. All right, there you can see the Korean Peninsula, and it's actually looks very big there, but it's a really small place compared to China. And it is divided into two parts, right? The red part up at the top is North Korea. It was expected that that part would become communist. And below the 38th parallel there in the middle, the green part below that was South Korea. It was expected that that would become capitalist and hopefully democratic. All right, so those two countries, by the way, I'll go ahead and give you the spoiler alert, they still look like that today. The North is still the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, a communist nation and very totalitarian. South Korea is a capitalist nation, remains so, and over the last 50 years or so has become much more democratic. All right, so in 1950, we have a crisis. Kim Il-sung, who is the grandfather of the current leader of North Korea, launches a war to reunite the two Koreas, right? He overruns the 38th parallel, goes into South Korea. The United States goes to the newly formed United Nations and says, we need to go fight a war in Korea to restore South Korea and to prevent it from becoming communist because of this idea of containment. Now, Harry Truman doesn't ask for Congress to declare war, as you know they must. He goes and does it as a military action. Our last declared war, you may know, was World War II. So he goes and he joins the United Nations troops, right, in South Korea, mostly the United States, and they will eventually, right, push the North Koreans back into North Korea. And in fact, they become so successful that they're going to push them up to the Chinese border. And at that point, one of our very important generals, Douglas MacArthur, turns to President Truman and he says publicly, we need to now invade China and restore it from communism to a capitalist country. President Truman says, no, the policy is containment. We're going to stop it from spreading. We're not going to go start another war in China. General MacArthur disagrees publicly with his boss. That gets you in trouble in the world. It's called insubordination. And as a result, he's going to be fired. And it makes the lesson for us. It's containment, not rollback. Right? We're going to exist in a communist world, or a world where there are communist nations, but we're not going to allow it to spread. Right? That's the Korean War. We're now going to move into the Eisenhower years. President Eisenhower was our great general at D-Day. Even though he's a general, he's actually going to lessen our direct military involvement. He's going to end the Korean War. We're going to draw that line right where it was at the beginning. He won't send troops into battle directly very often. He says we're going to take a new look to our military. We're going to focus on nuclear weapons buildup. Our theory is massive retaliation, or the threat of massive retaliation from Soviet aggression is going to stop them from spreading communism. He'll also extend those ideas of the Truman Doctrine to the Middle East. Sometimes he uses the CIA to go in and put down communist threats. He strengthens our NATO alliance, and he will begin sending advisors into Vietnam and up the level of our involvement there. All right, so also a Cold War warrior, President Eisenhower, and you can see that leads us to the nuclear arms race that is much better than it was at various earlier parts in our history, but is still there today. Roughly about 1,600 nuclear weapons employed by the U.S. and Russia around the world today. That's not all we have, but those are deployed, and you can see there are 9 to 10 known nuclear states, right? The last event we're going to talk about is Sputnik. And Sputnik might seem a little funny to you when we're talking about it because it is a 23-inch diameter ball. That is our first artificial satellite in space. And not ours, and that's the problem. It's the Soviets who have put the first artificial satellite in space. Not much of one, only 23 inches in diameter. How long is it up there? 3 weeks, and then its batteries die. But, right, it causes a crisis in the United States domestically, and it's going to make a lot of changes. We're falling behind, the fear is, and you'll learn about this in the next lesson. We're falling behind the Soviet Union. We have to change. We develop a space program. NASA has started. We're going to change the way we fund education. Lots of federal funding for science and math, and to develop lots of innovations, some of which eventually, way down the line, the internet will develop from some of those things that happened during this period of time. All right, so that's the conclusion of our lesson. We've learned about the Cold War. What was the Domino Theory and where was it applied? See if you know that. What led the U.S. to fight in the Korean War and how did that turn out? And then finally, how was Eisenhower's policy different than Truman's? All right, so if you want to see if you know the answers to this, what was the Domino Theory? The idea, if communism spread to any countries, that eventually all countries in Asia and Southeast Asia would fall to communism. Why do we fight in the Korean War? That domino theory, to stop the spread of communism into South Korea. And how was Eisenhower's policy different? Massive retaliation, new look. He's going to rely more on the arms race and military rather than sending our troops into war. So there we go. Thank you so much for listening. You've learned about the Cold War and how it started. You'll be talking about it in lots of lessons in the future. I've got a link here to a Google form, and on that Google form you'll find just one question about the lesson that will help me with teaching, but also you'll find 2 videos that can take you further into this information if you're interested, and a Kahoot that I've made for you to practice this knowledge. Thank you for being with me today. Have a great day.